Haumatakipe. My name is Sherman. I am a co-founder of our nonprofit NATIFS and CEO of my company, The Sous Chef, based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I am born and raised on Pine Ridge Reservation and enrolled with the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe. At NATIFS, our two main goals are creating access to Indigenous-focused foodways education, along with facilitating Indigenous food access to our many Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. We run a nonprofit kitchen called Indigenous Food Lab. Our mission with Indigenous Food Lab is to facilitate a lot of Indigenous-focused curriculum, creating a space for Indigenous culinary education and development, to be able to do a lot of food relief where necessary. We're hoping that we can work with tribal communities across Turtle Island to help them to develop more Indigenous food operations everywhere. In this series of videos, we're sharing recipes our culinary team at NATIFS have developed that combine commodity products available through the food distribution program on Indian Reservations, which is FDPIR. On top of that, utilizing indigenous wild edible foods that we found in our own regions. So if you're in the Midwest or Mountain Plains regions, these recipes are for you. We're hoping that people who have access to the commodity food program will be able to utilize these recipes. On top of that, spending some time outdoors and reconnecting with the nature around them as our ancestors did. We truly believe that bringing more Indigenous foods into our kitchen and onto our plates will help with our health and our wellness and our cultural diversity. Pilamae, and thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoy these recipes. So today we are making mulberry rosehip bars, and this is a really fun, super simple recipe. In Lakota, we utilize the word chonska for mulberry and unchinka for rosehip. These mulberry bars are super easy to make. They last quite a long time. You can put them in an airtight container and they'll last easily an entire week. Or you can freeze them after making some, and you can freeze them up to 3 months. So there's all sorts of ways to utilize this one. We wanted to keep this recipe extremely simple. So of course we have some fresh mulberries, and if you don't have access to mulberries, because mulberry season happens very fast, you can utilize other fruits. There's raspberries, there's blackberries, there's blueberries, there's strawberries, there's all sorts of berries out there in the forests and plains regions that you could find and utilize, even choke cherries, which take a little bit more processing. We also have some dried rose hips here. We harvest a lot of fresh rose hips in the summertime and late summer. I like to harvest them best towards the end of the year. I prefer letting them dry out because that way they'll last throughout the year. They take a little bit of processing because you have to get the seeds out of them, but they're easy to find. Rose hips are all over the plains or all over the forests. You're always going to find rose plants everywhere, and they're super delicious. They're high in vitamin C. They have a natural pectin, so when you add a little bit of hot water to these things, they just jam up super fast. It's really great. We also have some smooth peanut butter, unsweetened if you have it. And we also have some oats right here. And for this recipe, we're actually utilizing butter. We don't always utilize butter, and if you wanted to keep this recipe vegan, you can easily substitute something like sunflower oil or canola oil. We prefer sunflower oil. And we also have some dried raisins, and again, it's a very simple recipe. So for this recipe, we actually need very little pieces. So we have a couple of pots, just any kind of sauce pot you can use to heat up some water and heat up some berries in. We also have a nice non-stick baking tin, just this little 8x8 square, and it's going to be just a really great piece to have, and a wooden spoon and a rubber spatula if you have one. So those are really the necessary pieces for this recipe. And also, of course, you'll need a stovetop and access to an oven to bake these bars. All right, so let's start this recipe. It's going to be very simple. The first thing we want to do is get our oven going to 350 degrees. Perfect. And then this next step is actually we're just going to rehydrate these dried rose hips. This is about 3 tablespoons of dried rose hips, and I'm adding about what would be a 1/4 cup to this. And again, there's so much natural pectin in wild rose hips that this is going to just rehydrate so quickly, and within just a couple of minutes it's going to be a perfect jam jelly and super flavorful. You can already smell that aroma, and there's just going to be a ton of vitamin C, and it's just a really wonderful berry flavor. So I'm going to set that aside for a second, and then we're going to get these berries going here. So I'm adding all of these berries into this pot that we have, and I'm adding about 1 cup of water. which is barely just enough to cover the berries themselves. And then we're going to turn that up to a medium-high heat and just let this cook. So that was about 2 cups of berries and 1 cup of water. We don't want too much water because we just want this to have a really nice consistency. A little bit past the syrup, a little bit thick, but not too watery. Next, while the berries are cooking and the rose hips are rehydrating, I'm going to get our pan ready. So I'm going to butter this pan. Again, like if you want to keep this vegan or plant-based, you can utilize sunflower oil for this step. But I melted about 2 tablespoons of butter, and I'm going to add this to this pan, and I'm just going to spread this around. I've got a piece of paper towel here, and I just want to get it nice and oiled all the way around. All right, and we'll let that sit for a second. All right, let's see how these rose hips are doing. These are rehydrating extremely nicely. And rose hips are so good for your health. I mean, they're anti-inflammatory compounds that really support the protection and healing of cells in our bodies, and they promote a lot of heart health. These things are just so rich in vitamins, especially vitamin C and minerals, and support a lot of immune health. And they just taste so good. I mean, you can just really smell this right now, and it's really just turning into such a wonderful piece. And we're getting ready to add this to our berries in just a moment. All right, and these berries are picking up nicely. Berries, of course, are really good for us, especially these wild berries. They're rich in vitamin C. They have a lot of immune properties. There's a lot of antioxidants in these things. As you can see, we're not adding a lot of extra sugars. These berries just naturally carry a lot of sweetness, and they're really good for your insulin response. And again, they're fun to pick, especially with your kids. So these berries are looking great, and so are these rose hips, so I'm going to stir this in there. And we're just going to go from there. These are softening up super nicely, and they're just going to get better in here. I would probably just keep an eye on this. I mean, it really depends on how much water you're putting into this, but if you follow this recipe, it shouldn't take more than 15 minutes for this sauce to be done from start to finish. All right, so this sauce is looking great. It smells so good. It's really almost there. If you guys are out there harvesting wild berries, you know, there are apps you can find online to help you identify plants, but mulberry trees are pretty easy to identify, and you can't miss them when they're sprouting all the mulberries. They're just hanging all over the place because they're really large trees. Sometimes you need a ladder to get up there and get some of them. Sometimes we'll put sheets under the trees and just pull them all off right onto the sheets and then dump those sheets into a bucket. When you get home with those berries, you're going to want to really rinse them out really well, pick through them, try to get a lot of leaves and anything else that might be in there, and just make them, you know, really cleaned up for these recipes. If you're using a different kind of berries, you know, berry seasons are happening throughout the summer, so there's just all sorts of really cool stuff growing. You know, be careful harvesting blackberries. There's a lot of thorns. Blueberries are amazing if you're in the northern parts, and there's just so much fun out there. So just, you know, I have memories growing up as a child harvesting a lot of choke cherries, harvesting a lot of raspberries, and even wild currants and gooseberries out there on the plains and around the Black Hills. All right, so this looks perfect. So this sauce is just slightly thickened. It'll kind of stick to, if you have a spoon, or the spatula just kind of starts to coat the spatula a little bit. It's still just a little bit loose, but not too bad. And the berries are starting to break up and break down a little bit. And you can smash them up a little bit. It'll help the sauce thicken just a little bit more. But we're going to go ahead and start mixing all these pieces and get this recipe going real quick here. All right, so I'm going to turn this off. You can see that this berry sauce is looking great. And we're going to start just by dumping all this berry sauce carefully into this bowl. And it's going to be very hot, so just be careful not to splash yourself and try to get everything out of there. So that's why a heat-proof rubber spatula is a really great kitchen tool to have if you have one. Okay. All right, so we got this in here. In the first step, we're going to add about 2 tablespoons of butter to this. Will be about this. And I'm going to stir that in, melt that. And this berry sauce is really hot, so this butter will just melt right away right into those berries. And let's just get that stirred in a little bit. Perfect. And then we're going to add this smooth peanut butter into this mixture. In there. And again, we're going to stir this up and try to smooth this out just a little bit. And it smells so good. It's like peanut butter and jelly going on here. And the next steps is just adding our raisins. and stirring that in there. And finally, adding all of our oats. And I'm just going to slowly mix them in little by little, get them all incorporated nicely in here, and just make a really lovely mixture. And just try to scoop up from the bottom, stir it around, just get it all mixed in there. Perfect. And this is such an easy recipe you can do with your children, and it's just really fun to make. So now we're going to take our greased pan, and we're just going to pour all this in here. Try to get as much as you can out of it. And we're just going to smooth this out. And just make it really even. Make sure to get there in the corners, and just kind of spread it out really nice. Just kind of tap it down a little bit, make it even on top, because that way it'll bake nice and even when you put it in the oven. All right, so this guy is now ready to go in the oven, and we're going to cook it for 15 minutes at 350. All right, so time is there. And this is smelling so good and looking so great. Let's get this out of the oven carefully, of course. All right, we've let this cool down a little bit, and I'm just trying to get my way around the edges here and loosen this up. And if you let it cool down, it'll kind of pull away from the pan a little bit and make it easier. But we're going to flip it, and hopefully it stays in one piece. And if not, we'll make it look good. All right, so we carefully flip it. Give it a little tap, but try to drop it down. This is still a little bit warm, but it's cooling. And voila, look at that. All right, so now we're going to cut this up. All right, so we're going to make 12 cuts out of this piece. So I'm going to do a 3x4 cut. So the first thing I'm going to do is just cut it in half once the long way. Cut those in half. Try to make them as even as you can. And then I'm going to cut this part into 3 parts. Right. Now we have this really beautiful bar, and let's plate it up. All right, well, these turned out perfect, and again, it was really fun just to make such a simple recipe with just a very few ingredients and so much wild fruit in this particular recipe. If you want to freeze these, I would suggest wrapping these with parchment paper, then plastic wrap, or putting them into a nice freezer Ziploc bag. Again, if you wrap them pretty tight, try to get most of the air out, they should last for up to 3 months. But if you just want to keep these in your pan or put them in some Ziploc bags, again, just try to keep some air out of them so they don't dry out too much. And they should last for about 1 week if you want to keep them fresh. But I doubt anybody will have any problem trying to keep these too long in their household. All right, well, I hope you guys enjoyed this recipe. Pilamae for listening, and I hope you get to try this recipe at home, and I hope you get to get outside and harvest some wild berries this summer.